Hello, everybody. Let's jump right into learning, or behaviorism. Your book labels this unit as learning, but I think it's important to sit back for just a few minutes and understand that this is all about the behaviorist school of psychology. In the developmental unit, we spoke about Freud, and we spoke about some neo-Freudians or some psychodynamic theorists such as Erikson, Mary Ainsworth, that emphasized early experiences in life, and Freud himself was huge on this the concept of unconscious. Freud dominated for a while the field of psychology, but it is behaviorism that actually is the opposite to psychoanalysis, to Freud's psychoanalysis. And then it is behaviorism that takes over and becomes more dominant in the field. Now, there are three core behaviorist tenets that are actually quite radical and interesting, if you might say, if you contrast them with psychoanalysis. And the first of them is a strong emphasis on learning. Now, here I want to pause for a minute because we have to understand that the difference between how we use learning in everyday language and how we use it in psychology. In everyday language, we use the term to express perhaps something that we have, the knowledge that we have input by, let's say, a class, a teacher. We refer it and limit it to only education or an educational experience. Now, behaviorism does not consider this educational input or gaining of knowledge as part of learning. It does, and we're going to talk about that towards the cognitive, sort of the later part of the unit. But learning in psychology has a much broader sense, has a much broader approach. Well, I would say it implies a broader concept. And it is, have your pencils ready, it's defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that occurs as a result of experience. Now, please focus on a minute on some terminology in this concept. The first of it is change. So a change involves a pre and a post. There's an event, an experience, an interaction, right, with the environment, and there's going to be a change. I don't know, we can learn to play the piano louder or softer or faster or slower. We can learn a different way of doing something, and therefore there's a change in behavior. A different way of coping with a challenge, with a stressor in the environment. That is a change, which may seem a little bit too simplistic or self-evident, but it's important to have that in mind, and you'll see later on why. The other is behavior itself as a term, part of this concept of learning, and remember that behavior is any act that is observable. Feeling sad is not behavior. Crying is behavior. So because we can measure it and observe it, we can see the tears in somebody's eyes, coming out of somebody's eyes as something measurable. And then experience is any interaction with the environment. And while we have to make sure to remember that not every single interaction with the environment is going to lead to a long-lasting, a relatively permanent change in our behavior. Perhaps it won't. But so remember, learning involves a relatively permanent change in behavior, observable, that occurs as a result of experience. That means this interaction with the environment. Very important to master that concept. So going back to the three tenets of behaviorism, the three radical ideas that sort of shifted dramatically from Freud's emphasis on the unconscious, is that the strong view that they had was this emphasis on learning was that behaviorism is that basically everything we know, everything we are, is a result of experience. So we're moving far away from this idea that there's this real human nature, moving more towards John Locke's idea of us being born as a clean slate. When we are being born as a clean slate, if we are born as a clean slate, that means that we are infinitely malleable. Everything we become, as I just said, it depends on are a result of experience. There's a quote from John Watson, basically John B. Watson, if you remember him from the first unit, in which he said that, and I think he was paraphrasing the sort of I think it's claim from, I don't know, sort of a group of religion. I think it was the Jesuits, but don't take my word on that. And his quote read the following. So please have your pencils in hand and ready to go, because I think that by writing this down, you'll get really sort of an experience of really understanding closely this understanding that is at the core of behaviorism. John B. Watson said that, again paraphrasing from this religious statement, give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggarman and thief. Regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. I am going beyond my facts, and I admit it, but so have the advocates of the contrary, and they have been doing it for many thousands of years. So the first part of that quote can summarize this emphasis that behaviorism's explanation of our behavior, of our acting, is that everything we know is control. We are internally malleable by our environment, by our interaction with our environment, meaning depending on our experiences. There is no innate nature, no human nature, there's no idea of us coming into the world with already certain predispositions, and yes, that basically is it, this tenet of emphasizing on learning. And the second aspect of behaviorism was anti-mentalism. And what this means is that the behaviorists were sort of obsessed with this idea that by doing science, because that was their main goal, to make of psychology a really hard science as chemistry and physics. And they felt this, this need to do this largely in reaction to Freud, to his psychoanalytical school, that claims about these mental states like desires, wishes, goals, emotions, and so on. So they claimed that this was incredibly unscientific, Freud's views. So again, think about it. These invisible, vague things can never form the basis of a serious science. So this behaviorist manifesto, so you would call it, would then be to develop a science without anything that's unobservable, meaning that everything had to be observable, and using notions such as stimulus and response and reinforcement and punishment. We're going to talk about that in the environment that referred to real world, observable, tangible events. Then, and this one is also very radical, and it is that the third tenet is that behaviorists believe that there was no interesting differences across species. Now, a behaviorist might admit that a human can do things a rat and a pigeon couldn't do, but a behaviorist might just say, well, look, those are just general associative powers that differ. Or they may even deny it, the most radical behaviorists. But they might say, for instance, that human and rats aren't different at all. It's just humans tend to live in a richer environment than rats. So from that standpoint, from the theoretical standpoint, comes this methodological approach, which is if they are all the same, then you could study human learning by studying non-human animals. And we're going to see a lot of that too. And that's basically how behaviorists tested the behavior and measured it and examined it in laboratory settings. is by basically equating humans to animals, because this idea, basically, there was no, again, as I said, there was no interesting differences across species. So now that we've observed or talked about these three basic tenets of behaviorism, and trust me, it's very useful to know these for many questions in your AP exam, and for those interested in the theory of psychology itself. So learning we have already defined as this relatively permanent change in behavior and knowledge that occurs as the result of experience. Habituation, we spoke about that in developmental psychology, but this is, for behaviorists, habituation is the very simplest form of learning. I mean, and what this is technically described is a decline, remember in developmental psychology, is the decline in the tendency to respond to stimuli that are familiar due to repeated exposure. So for instance, if I yell in the middle of class, "Hey, you!" At first, it's going to startle many of you, right? It's going to be, what the hell is he doing? But then if I picture me saying that again and again, "Hey, you! Hey, you! You! Hey, you!" It's going to get to a point that you will habituate to that sound, and just, by the third, fourth time, I'll be, I don't know, sounding like I'm crazy or just goofy, or just, what is he trying to, is he doing a demo or something? And it won't startle you anymore. So it's basically a psychological term to express that we have become used to something. And that's basically the most basic form of learning. And you can see how there is a change, a relatively permanent change in behavior after you've heard a song 1,000 times. Then you habituate to that song, and while you may enjoy it, remembering this concept of mere exposure effect, while you may enjoy it, after hearing it for a long time, you also become used to it. You become habituated to it, and perhaps that first excitement or enjoyment that you would take from that stimulus is no longer the case, because you have habituated, you have changed your response to that or your behavior towards that song. And of course, habituation is something we experience in everyday life. We get used to many sounds in our environment, right? We get used to the ticking of a clock. Well, I actually don't. I find that very hard. But you guys know me. I'm sort of an outlier in that sense. Or to the noise of traffic. In fact, I feel sometimes the noise of traffic now pretty soothing, because I have habituated to it. It doesn't startle me at all. But people who visit me from Venezuela think I'm crazy for living in New York City. But these are all actual very important forms of learning, because if we think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, imagine life without becoming habituated to anything. I mean, that's basically, imagine not getting ever used to anything. So, you suddenly, somebody steps forward and waves their hand, and you go, oh my God, what is he doing? Oh, what is this? And then that person waves their hand again. What is he doing? So it would mean everything would be a surprise. We would be basically paralyzed without being able to function. And so if you think about it, it's actually very important to get used to things. It's very important to habituate, because as an adaptive mechanism, it allows us to keep track on new events and new objects. And it's important to notice something when it's new, because then you have to decide whether it's going to allow you to survive or not, whether it's going to harm you or not. And you need to know if there is any sort of new events or objects in your surroundings in order to plan on how to deal with it or to attend to. But you can't, you can't keep on noticing it, because if we habituate to threats in our environment, then that, of course, would be detrimental to our chances of surviving. So then going back to the concept of learning and habituation as the most simplest form of learning, how do we habituate to things? Well, it occurs through experience, through our interaction with our environment. When I hear those ambulance sirens at night that for me are soothing, right? It's because I'm hearing it in the environment. It's basically my experience of hearing them, as I'm sure it is for many of you. So, and it changes my way of thinking through experience, meaning when I first arrived here from Venezuela, it was very difficult for me to sort of sleep when I was hearing all these noises of construction in the morning, or they would wake me up. Now I can perhaps sleep through them. And another just final note for habituation is, as we saw in developmental psychology, although worth repeating, is that developmental psychologists use habituation as a way to study people, especially nonverbal humans, such as young babies. Using their habituation to know whether or not novel stimuli, whether they notice a change between an old stimulus and a new one, what captures their attention. Since babies cannot report verbally, we developmental psychologists need to use this habituation, this form of learning, as an important technique in their studies to measure behavior. Something key to understand behaviorism is also the concept of stimulus. In politics or in government, economy, we hear this term a lot too, as in sort of stimulation. When people say, this tax will act as a stimulus to the economy. I don't know. I'm very bad at this type of terminology in everyday or in economy. But in psychology, again, we have to understand the difference between how this term is used in everyday life and in psychology. In psychology, it means basically, have your pencils ready, is any event, any object or any event that evokes a specific reaction in an organism. So it's, again, any event that evokes a response from anybody, from an organism. We'll see that for behaviorists, humans were basically equal to slugs. This is why there's going to be a lot of talk about organisms, because even a cockroach would learn behavior as shown in their laboratory studies. So again, stimulus is any event that evokes a response, anything in the environment. So water could be a stimulus. Breeze of air. I'm trying to think about very basic things. Hearing the steps of somebody else. Anything, if it evokes a response, then it can be considered a stimulus. A rainy day, etc. You get the idea, hopefully. The next concept, before we go into the different types of conditioning, is associative learning. I've seen and I've heard many people use associative learning as equating it to classical conditioning. They're not exactly the same. So associative learning is associative learning occurs when two or more things are paired together in time and or space. Okay, so again, there's learning here. There's going to be a change in behavior or a change in knowledge after two things are put together based on two things being paired together in time or space. For instance, a very basic one is salt and pepper. No, I'm not referring to the 90s group, which I kind of liked, but it's basically literally salt and pepper. So if you go to a diner, and we've seen, I'll take that back. So going back to the example, salt and pepper, right? We've learned seeing salt and pepper, these the jars of salt and pepper placed together, that I can guarantee you that if we go to a diner and see salt and not the pepper, basically by seeing the salt, we're going to associate it with pepper, because we have learned that the two of them go together. How has this occurred? Through repeated exposure to these two or more things being paired together in time or in space. So, sort of think about another example that you might have of something that you knowledge or behavior that you have acquired through associative learning. It's basically associating two things that always go together, or expecting one thing to be there when the other is there, that other part. So, and again, it could involve many more things. So hopefully that example can serve as it is the basis of conditioning in general. But remember, associative learning occurs when there is a change, a permanent change in behavior or in knowledge that occurs as a result of experience, and this experience involves two or more things that are paired together in time and in space. So associative learning is going to be classical conditioning and operant conditioning. We're going to focus on these in the next screencast. Are two forms of associative learning, and so is cognitive learning. So, but I want to focus on these two, classical and operant conditioning, for now. To understand classical conditioning, we need to talk about Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov actually came across this concept out of pure scientific serendipity, basically. He did not intend to study learning at all. He wasn't interested. In fact, Ivan Pavlov, as I said, was not a psychologist. He was a physiologist. And he would study, more specifically, he spent many years studying digestion in dogs. Yeah, very appealing. And for this study, in particular, he was measuring saliva. And in order to make the dogs salivate, he basically had these groups of dogs, and in the textbook you'll see these sort of machinery that he used to put them in and collect the saliva. But to make them salivate, he would pour this meat powder in their mouths, which would cause a salivation, and he would collect the saliva and study it. Yummy, very appealing. So what was happening is that after repeating this procedure day by day, he noticed that the dogs began to salivate before the meat powder was given to them in their mouths. Apparently, actually what was happening was that through associative learning, the dogs were responding to the person entering the room, which signaled to them, they associated person, research assistant, the specific person is entering the room. That means meat powder is on the way. They anticipated it and therefore began responding to the person as they would naturally do to the meat powder. And this is what he labeled and coined as classical conditioning. So Pavlov developed his theory of classical conditioning by making the distinction between two sorts of stimulus-response relationships. Again, we have two different stimulus-response relationships. One of them is going to be unconditioned, and the other one is going to be conditioned. So let's begin with the first one. You have on top, you have an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. And this is basically what we start off with. We start, an unconditioned stimulus is any event in the environment that is going to lead to a natural, a reflective, remember that, a sort of a reflexive response. An example of this could be if somebody pokes you with a stick and you say, ouch, Well, the poking in the stick would be the unconditioned stimulus. The ouch, as a natural response, this is something we have not learned, it's just a reflexive response basically, is the unconditioned response. So going back to Pavlov, when he put food powder in the dog's mouth and the saliva was generated, that's an unconditioned stimulus giving rise to an unconditioned response. So we have, in Pavlov's case, in his studies, was the meat powder is the unconditioned stimulus. Why is it an unconditioned stimulus? Because based on the response that the dogs made, which is basically to salivate, to prepare the digestive system, it's a natural response. It's not something that we consciously activate salivation. It's something that automatically happens. So we have an unconditioned stimulus giving rise to an unconditioned response. Then in classical conditioning, is that another association begins to develop. And that's one between a conditioned stimulus giving rise to a conditioned response. But in order for this to happen, guys, and I hope I'm making this clear, is that there needs to be the introduction here of a neutral stimulus. A neutral stimulus is basically something that does not give rise to an either unconditioned response or a conditioned response. So, as we know, actually it wasn't a bell, it was a metronome, but I don't know the technicalities behind that, so let's just go with the myth of the bell story. So a bell, in this particular context, would be a neutral stimulus. Why? Because what does it cause? What does a bell ringing cause? In this context, no behavior. It wouldn't cause the dogs to necessarily activate or give rise in them to a particular response. But what happens was that by pairing, in this case, the neutral stimulus, the bell, with the unconditioned stimulus, right? So we're pairing bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, bell, food. This new learning that was occurring here, what Pavlov started to notice was that what was supposed to be a neutral stimulus was causing the dogs to begin to salivate just by hearing the bell ring. So again, they were no longer salivating just because the meat powder was being poured in their mouth, which would be a natural reaction, an unconditioned response to an unconditioned stimulus. But now, this neutral stimulus that was introduced and paired constantly with the unconditioned stimulus was now becoming, the neutral stimulus now became a conditioned stimulus, giving rise to a conditioned response. Notice how the unconditioned response, which is a salivation, was an unconditioned response based to its relationship with the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food itself. But through repetitive pairings with a neutral stimulus, that unconditioned response became a conditioned response to the conditioned stimulus, which is, it's sort of an unnatural reaction. It's a reaction that the dogs learned. Remember the concept of learning, it's the permanent change of behavior. So now the dogs were salivating just by hearing the bell ring. And so again, I want to review that an unconditioned stimulus is always going to, right here, the unconditioned stimulus is always going to result in it reflexively produces an unconditioned response. So a good test for determining if a behavior is an unconditioned response is to ask basically every member of a certain species, ask everyone else if they would exhibit that same reflexive behavior from birth. So examples of an unconditioned stimulus and their respective underline respective, and their respective unconditioned responses might include, one example is, let's see, a puff of air blown into somebody's eyes is going to cause what? What is it going to cause you to do? What is going to be the unconditioned response to that unconditioned stimulus? Well, it's going to be basically to blink, to close your eyes, right? So that's an unconditioned stimulus giving rise to an unconditioned response. Placing food in your mouth is going to cause salivation, as in Pavlov's experiment. I don't know, a hot environment causing you to sweat. Well, that's an unconditioned stimulus, hot temperature or high temperature, and then leading to an unconditioned response, which is something we can't control, which in this case would be sweating. I don't know, a very loud sound, this is going to become relevant later on, a very loud sound is going to cause a behavioral signs of fear. Perhaps somebody's going to scream, somebody's going to, I don't know, to wave their hands. And what would everyone do when they hear a sudden loud sound? That again is a relationship between an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. Now, a conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that has become to elicit a conditioned response. It's something that we need to learn, because an organism or ourselves, we learn to associate the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned, the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. So the neutral, originally neutral stimulus, by pairing it with the unconditioned stimulus, pairing them, so NS with US all the time, so we're going to very likely, conditioning occurs when the NS becomes the CS, giving rise to the same response that the same original response we had to the unconditioned stimulus. I'll give you an example. For instance, let's say we salivate when we eat in Commons every day, right? So you go to Commons, you put food in your plate, you're going to eat it, the unconditioned stimulus, the food in Commons, and the unconditioned response. So if we have a routine of, let's say, cleaning our hands with hand sanitizer, which is something we shouldn't, we should wash our hands, but let's say somebody has a custom of using hand sanitizer, they're rushed and they're really hungry and they want to eat. So again, hand sanitizer, go and put food on your plate, eat food, salivation. Hand sanitizer, go. So the hand sanitizer should not cause salivation, but if this constant pairing, daily pairing of this unconditioned stimulus, which is the food causing us to salivate, conditioned response, through this constant pairing of this now neutral stimulus with going to eat in Commons, hand sanitizer, going to eat with Commons, hand sanitizer, what used to be a neutral stimulus, is now going to become a conditioned stimulus, and we might begin to salivate every time we go and put hand sanitizer on our hands. This is basically classical conditioning. So just to review, here we have the unconditioned stimulus, which is basically food in the mouth. And you have an unconditioned response to that unconditioned stimulus, which is salivation. This is something that is not learned. Food produces automatically, reflexively, salivation. You introduce a neutral stimulus. Why is it called a neutral stimulus at the beginning? A tone with this metronome. I forget the name of this device. But so you have the bell or the metronome or whatever. The tone basically does not produce salivation. It's a neutral stimulus. It does not produce any reflexive salivation in the dog. Through acquisition, that is, pairing tone, food, tone, food, tone, food, eventually conditioning will occur. Basically, the tone by itself will produce salivation. But then, extinction will occur if you continue showing the conditioned stimulus, in this case the tone, without the unconditioned stimulus, which was the food. If you show this one by itself, then no longer you're showing the food, which is what produces the unconditioned response. If you just show the conditioned stimulus by itself, the dog will at a certain point say, wait a minute, this is not, why am I salivating for? Of course, this is an automatic, but I'm just trying to say the way they learn and unlearn the behavior, because extinction is basically unlearning this behavior. And so you keep on presenting, this is why it's called procedure, through which the conditioning is weakened or basically disappears, stops. It's because you present the conditioned stimulus by itself, and by presenting it by itself, then eventually the dog is going to realize, okay, no food after this, so well, why am I salivating for? The salivation stops, and the conditioned stimulus is no longer a conditioned stimulus because it no longer produces a conditioned response. And this not producing, stopping process is what extinction is. Again, the procedure through which extinction occurs is by showing the conditioned stimulus by itself. So let's go through another example that is provided in your textbook, in fact, I think. So, two people kiss. The response to two people kissing, for the people kissing themselves, is that there is romantic arousal, right? So we have an unconditioned response an unconditioned stimulus, US, giving rise to an unconditioned response. This pairing occurs naturally. It's reflexive. Okay, so here we have an US giving rise to a UR. Okay, so then if we, let's just say, so it's kind of a funny example. So onion breath does not at all give arousal, but let's just say, for some reason, these people were so madly in love that they would ignore the onion breath of each other. Or let's say, I don't know, Tom's breath was that of onions, and this girl, I don't know, I'm going to call her Sally. Sally would kiss Tim. Was it Tim that I said? Tim every day. There was a constant pairing of a neutral stimulus, right? And kissing Tom. Neutral stimulus, kissing Tom. And then what would happen here, according to conditioning, is that Sally might associate onion breath with becoming romantically aroused without Tim in the picture. So through classical conditioning, she learned this response, this behavior of becoming romantically aroused whenever the stimulus, originally presented as a neutral stimulus, now a conditioned stimulus, because it's giving rise to a behavior that is not reflexive of behavior that she learned. And through classical conditioning, now she responds to with a romantic arousal to just the scent of that wonderful onion breath. And this occurs with classical conditioning. Okay, so a couple things that we have to know also by classical conditioning that are explained in your book are the terms acquisition. Again, use these screencasts for this week as basically knowing on what to basically focus in your book, but your book will provide a better explanation for the most part. But acquisition is the process through which we acquire, it's the process itself of becoming conditioned. It involves the repeated pairings of the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. So by pairing, in the previous example, onion kissing, onion kissing, onion kissing, onion kissing, through this pairing is the acquisition of this learned behavior in Sally's case. So how did she acquire the behavior? Through the constant pairing. And it should be known that and it's logical, this makes common sense, is that the more number of pairings, what they call in psychology trials, so, like kissing and onion breath, the more trials, then the stronger the conditioned response. That sort of makes sense, but remember that. And also the first few trials produce the greatest rate of learning, so because then it levels off. So again, as a previous example, onion breath, I don't know why that example, but onion breath kissing, onion breath kissing, onion breath kissing. As you can see, there's a curve here, and then it levels off. So these the first trials are going to be the strongest ones, the ones that are going to where the greatest rate of learning occurs. And another important concept to understand is that of higher order conditioning, or second-order conditioning. And it works like this. It's basically when a second neutral stimulus is introduced in the process, and then that second neutral stimulus, by pairing it with a conditioned stimulus, again, guys, with a conditioned stimulus, then it will evoke the same response. So let's just do the following example. So I like the example of, let's say, when somebody is kissing their a partner they like, they feel attracted to, their girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever the case might be, the kiss itself would be a unconditioned stimulus that will cause feelings of warmth, right? And arousal, correct? And that would be, warmth would be the unconditioned response to that unconditioned stimulus. Okay, so then let's say you break up with this other person, but and then 6 months after, just thinking about this person will evoke that unconditioned response, right? So you introduce the neutral stimulus, which is thinking about this person, just picturing that person, the former boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever the case might be, and then because this relationship of kiss, person I used to like or love, kiss, person I used to like or love, then that person itself became, just thinking about this person evoked the feelings of warmth or arousal. Now, let's just say that this person used to wear a particular cologne, and then that cologne would be so the person itself would be neutral stimulus 1, right? That becomes a conditioned stimulus, the thought of the person, causing former lover, whatever the case might be, causing the conditioned response of warmth, right? Now, if you let's say that particular person had wore a particular cologne or perfume, so by pairing that person with a cologne, person with a cologne, person with a cologne, that acquisition period occurred too. So then now the neutral stimulus too would be the cologne itself, right? And let's say you smell the cologne or perfume on a different person, right? It's not the former boyfriend or girlfriend, on a different person, then, and that cologne itself is going to produce by itself feelings of warmth as well, then that could become then the conditioned stimulus 2, or the higher order conditioning has occurred because you associate the second neutral stimulus with feelings. So that the smell of the cologne itself, again, without the person, is evoking feelings of warmth, and that would be that original same unconditioned response, but based on this second neutral stimulus that was introduced. And here is where higher order conditioning has occurred. Another important concept is extinction. And extinction is basically the procedure that leads to the gradual stopping, or let's say first gradual weakening and then eventual stopping of the conditioned response. And when they talk about procedure, basically how do you extinct this condition, this learning that has occurred between the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response? It's basically presenting the conditioned stimulus by itself, alone. So you have the period of acquisition, you pair the two, and then you stop presenting the unconditioned stimulus. You just present the conditioned stimulus. And this is going to lead to, again, the weakening and the eventual disappearance of the conditioned response. Let's go to the example of Pavlov to illustrate this with an example. Okay, so then another concept, spontaneous recovery. Now this occurs when, we spoke about extinction, about how eventually the conditioned response will fade, will weaken, and then disappear. Now, what happens with this learning process? Do we forget it entirely? Well, through spontaneous recovery, which is basically the reappearance of the conditioned response after absolutely no period of training, after no period of acquisition, of pairing it again. So basically what spontaneous recovery tells us is, this phenomenon tells us, is that these associations, this associative learning that occurs through classical conditioning is not completely forgotten. It's there somewhere. And yeah, so basically that. So extinction does not mean forgetting entirely, but rather that the conditioned stimulus now signals the absence of the unconditioned stimulus. So, but spontaneous recovery tells us that, let's just put it through this example. Like, let's say a traumatic event, right? You are attacked by a dog, a particular dog. And of course, this, since it's a traumatic process, the acquisition isn't necessary to pair these, dog. Then the response of that particular dog was, you got hurt, you felt pain, so you associated both of them. And that's important also to notice that acquisition through a traumatic event does not need repeated pairing, does not require this acquisition. Acquisition is just occurs basically by this traumatic event. All right. So then the person has associated now. When this person sees, this person goes to therapy, and in therapy. This person is shown or is trained to unlearn the association with dog and attack. And this is when the extinction process occurs, right? Okay, so then after a while, stops therapy, right? Is this process right? It's this time period right here, no training occurs or no traumatic event happens again. Well, this fear, the conditioned response, this fear of dogs in general, the next time this person sees a dog, well, very likely they will experience a spontaneous recovery, meaning, again, they associate fear with that dog. The dog, the conditioned response, because it's not the same original dog of the attack, any dog will have been conditioned to feel fear, to feel this phobia for that dog. So very likely, I will experience again fear, but not as strong. Notice the difference in strength here. Very likely, spontaneous recovery of a conditioned response, in this case fear, to a dog that I see on the street, will not be as strong as as the fear I had before therapy. So where I learned to extinguish this behavior or make this this response extinct. And spontaneous recovery, again, the extinction will be particularly quicker, will occur in less time. Two other things we need to talk about are stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. And generalization is basically lumping stimuli that are similar to each other in sort of one same category, producing the same response or similar responses, or whether we can discriminate or notice the difference between stimuli that will produce a particular response and which one will not. So let's begin with generalization or stimulus generalization. And as your textbook explains, stimulus generalization is the tendency for conditioned stimulus to evoke similar responses after the response has been conditioned. Let's see, for instance, if a child has been conditioned to fear, and this example I'm making it arbitrary because those of you who've done the reading know where I'm going to, but let's say a child has been conditioned to fear a stuffed white rabbit. Very likely the child will also exhibit fear of objects or animals that are similar to this conditioned stimulus. Again, the child learned to fear a stuffed white rabbit, and perhaps it will also learn how to fear a stuffed white or a white, I don't know, white dog, a white cat, or whatever it might be. Something, so if this child does fear a similar object or a similar animal to the one he was originally conditioned. Remember, we're talking about the similarity between the conditioned stimulus and an object that is similar to the conditioned stimulus. Then that child will have generalized the response to these other objects. So he no longer responds with fear to the conditioned stimulus. He's also responding to, because he's generalized it to this other neutral stimuli that is similar to the conditioned stimulus. Now, discrimination is actually the opposite, is being able to know when one conditioned stimulus is different from another and therefore will not evoke this conditioned response. So, for instance, imagine, I have this example I just read about, and imagine a dog that has been trained to run to his owner while he hears a particular whistle. Now, after the dog has been conditioned, right, the dog might respond to a variety of sounds that are similar to the whistle. In this case, we're not talking about discrimination. We're talking about the dog generalizing this response to other similar stimuli, right, to the original whistle, which was the conditioned stimulus. Now, let's say trainers are very specific with what they want their dogs to respond to. And so perhaps the trainer now wants the dog to respond only to a specific sound of the whistle. So then eventually the trainer can work with the animal to teach him how to discriminate between sounds. So eventually the dog will respond only to the whistle and not to, let's say, a bell or an alarm or whatever the case might be, whatever similar tone he generalized before and no longer does. So again, discrimination is knowing how we can differentiate, is being able to differentiate one conditioned stimulus from a neutral stimulus that does not evoke that conditioned response. So I'll give you an example, a more relatable, hopefully, example of both of these. So going back to generalization, right, in advertisement. Think about a brand that makes, different things, right? They don't only specialize, let's say, in shoes or athletic shoes, or they also do clothing, and they also have a cologne, they also have all these different things, right? So they want, perhaps, if they enjoy a reputable or a prestigious sort of they evoke in you trust and good quality, and they've conditioned us to believe that there is an association between that brand and high quality, or that brand and attractiveness, whatever the conditioning was, right? So perhaps they specialize in shoes, right? Athletic shoes. And then when we, let's say we go to their store, we see the shoes, and we immediately say, oh, well, those are the shoes I buy, and those are the best shoes ever, and blah, blah, blah. Well, they want you to generalize their brand to that stimulus, the shoes. They want you to generalize it to other products that they might have, so that you spend more money to this. And this they do them by a logo. And that logo is going to perhaps evoke in us a similar response to the shoes that we already know, to other things, and therefore we're going to say, oh, that shirt, I haven't tried it before, or that type of clothing, I haven't tried it before, but it must be of the same quality. I'm generalizing it to the other products that same brand has, and the trigger there is the logo. That's how they want you to generalize their good quality to other things. Now, discrimination is also useful in advertisement. If you think about it, perhaps if I am a new brand in the market, and now that we're on the subject of colognes, so I have a particular cologne, and I am going to go into the market. There are many colognes, right? Many types of perfumes, etc. So I want, in order, as a newcomer to this industry, I want my product to be discriminated. I want it to sort of step out. And how am I going to do that? Stand out, How am I going to do that? Perhaps by a very provocative commercial, perhaps a high sexually charged or very controversial commercial. And that's how I want my customers to discriminate me, differentiate me from the rest of the other brands that they perhaps don't even know about. But I, with that advertisement, that specifically provocative advertisement, I am going to aim towards people, my audience, discriminating and therefore noticing me that I'm different from the others. Again, I don't want them to think about sort of this safe, traditional cologne or whatever the case might be. I want them to think about, something that's going to stand out because they're not that, right? I want them to discriminate me against the normal, common brand of cologne out there in the market. So hopefully these examples worked. I remember they worked with me when I started learning this. Now, to end classical conditioning, and also to begin with the applications of classical conditioning to real life, we need to talk about John B. Watson and his study with little Albert. Actually, the study was done with who became later his wife. I forget her name right now. It's in your text, but the two of them devised this study, and it had to do with whether classical conditioning could be applied in the learning of phobias, because there was this idea that a behaviorist approach to analyzing a phobia is that basically we learned it, that phobias are learned, and therefore their question was can they be learned? Let's confirm this, right? That's our hypothesis, and if they can be learned, that means that through extinction, perhaps they can be unlearned, right? So what they did was they used the little Albert. Now, again, the ethics of this study are actually quite horrendous, and they would never go through an IRB today. But this was, I believe, the 50s, the 40s, forget also the decade, I'm sorry. So they brought little Albert into a room. And little Albert, as you might see on this side right here, he's playing with a white mouse. Little Albert enjoyed playing with the mouse, meaning in this case, the stimulus provoked in him, desire to touch it, play with it, and etc. So then what they did was they presented the mouse, but right before the mouse, they were presenting the loud noise, sort of this very, very loud noise, and they would present the mouse. So loud noise, then the mouse. Loud noise, the mouse. And if you see the video, I'll see if I can include it. It's very cruel because they had these, this very very loud sound that they created with this instrument. And what happened was that little Albert developed a fear of mouse. So then, again, the unconditioned stimulus, which is the banging of this instrument that I forget the name of, the unconditioned response is the crying, the expression of fear, right? Again, and then if they pair it with a neutral stimulus, which in this case was the mouse, which he normally enjoyed playing with, so it was bang, the loud sound, mouse. Loud sound, mouse. Again, the acquisition is occurring here by pairing the unconditioned stimulus, the banging of this instrument, with the neutral stimulus, which is the white mouse. Eventually, little Albert, just by seeing the mouse, would fear it after having enjoyed playing with it. And this is when conditioning occurred through the acquisition, the pairing of the banging with the mouse. Eventually, he learned a new behavior that was permanent, that relatively permanent for a while. And then what happened was that once he saw the mouse without this loud noise, then it still evoked a conditioned response, which was the crying, fearing, as if he was hearing this very loud noise. He responded to this conditioned stimulus in a way he would respond also to the loud noise. This is the basis of how phobias are treated in a normal psych. Hopefully we'll have time to talk a little about that. But this is, again, the basis of the relevance of little Albert's study, and it is that phobias are likely learned, most likely learned, or in most cases learned, and they can be unlearned too, and much of the treatment for these is based on this particular study. So it does have its value, still, pretty cool, and I think that it was I think his partner, forget her name right now, was developed a study in which they could unlearn particular phobias, and again, leading to the treatment today of them. Okay, that's all for classical conditioning, guys. Oh, I forget, one more thing, timing. Timing, the best timing for, and this is explained in your textbook, is to present the conditioned stimulus or the neutral stimulus, right, while you're in the period of acquisition, to present it seconds before, or I think half a second before, the unconditioned stimulus. So in the case of the dogs, it's like the bell, right, and then half a second later, the meat powder in the mouth. Bell, half a second later, meat powder in the mouth. In the case of little Albert, optimally, they would show the mouse, which is the neutral stimulus. You want it to turn into the conditioned stimulus in acquisition. So they would show the mouse. Half a second later, boom, the loud sound. And again, mouse, half a second later, and then the unconditioned stimulus, which was the loud noise. Timing is important. There's a lot of talk about timing and everything, but for classical conditioning, basically what you need to know is that. All right, the order, and they have to be close to each other in order for classical conditioning to be more efficient. All right, guys, thank you.